There are houses that are only places to sleep, and there are houses that remember. Mine remembers everything. It remembers the morning I poured the first bucket of concrete into the footings, back when my hair was still black and my back didn't ache when the weather turned. It remembers the summer my wife Margaret hung sheets on the line out back, and the wind carried the smell of bleach and lavender all the way up to where I was nailing the roof down, one shingle at a time. It remembers the night our daughter was born, when I drove like a fool down that hill in a snowstorm and prayed every mile that we'd make the hospital in time. It remembers Margaret's last winter, when the wood stove burned low and she sat in her chair by the window and watched the cardinals come to the feeder I built her for our 30th anniversary. A house like that doesn't forget, and neither does the man who built it. My name is Arthur Whitaker, and I am 65 years old. I live alone on a ridge called Cedar Hill, about 12 miles outside of Briar Gap, in the western part of North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge Mountains start to fold themselves into the sky. I spent 42 years in the building trades, most of them pouring foundations and framing houses for other people. I raised barns. I patched roofs after storms. I dug wells in clay that would break a younger man's back. Toward the end, I had a small crew of my own, 6 men I trusted, and one truck that ran more on prayer than gasoline. Then I retired. 3 years ago this past spring, and the truck went to a young man in Hendersonville who needed it more than I did. My hands are crooked now. The knuckles swell when the cold comes in, and my right thumb won't bend the way it used to, ever since I caught it under a header beam back in 1986. But the hands still know what they know. They still know the weight of a hammer. They still know the feel of mortar when it's set just right. And on mornings like this one, when I wrap them around a hot cup of black coffee and step out onto my porch, they still know how to hold on to something good. It was the 3rd week of September. The mountains were just starting to turn a little yellow up high in the maples, a little red creeping into the dogwoods down by the creek. The fog sat low in the valley below my hill, thick as cotton batting, and the sun was just beginning to burn a hole through it. I stood at the railing and watched the world come back into focus. That fog is one of the things I love most about this place. Every morning, it covers everything, and every morning, it lifts. There's a lesson in that, I think, but I'm not in any hurry to name it. The porch wraps all the way around the house. I built it that way on purpose. Margaret used to say a house without a porch was like a man without a handshake closed off. No invitation. So I gave her a porch she could walk all the way around without ever having to turn back. She liked to do that in the evenings, after supper. She'd start at the kitchen door and end up at the kitchen door, and somewhere along the way she'd have gathered her thoughts. I still walk that loop sometimes, when I miss her too much to sit still. The house itself is a 2-story craftsman, painted the color of pale river stone. The roof is steep, dark green metal, and I put it on myself the summer I turned 48. The chimney is fieldstone, gathered piece by piece from the creek bed at the bottom of the hill, every stone shaped by water before I ever picked it up. The porch posts are white oak, hand-planed. The front door is heart pine, and the brass knocker on it was the first thing Margaret and I ever bought together, back when we were newlyweds living in a rented apartment in Asheville and dreaming of a place like this. Inside, the floors are wide plank oak, pegged, not nailed, the old way. The walls are real plaster over horsehair lath, not the thin drywall they use today. The windows are double hung, with weights and ropes the way windows were meant to be made. When the wind blows hard against the west side of the house, those windows whistle, low and soft, and I have come to think of it as the house humming to itself. I walked back inside and set my coffee on the kitchen counter. The kitchen is small by the standards of the magazines my daughter brings me sometimes. There's a farmhouse sink Margaret picked out at an estate sale in Black Mountain, and a butcher block I made out of scraps left over from when I built the dining table. The cabinets are knotty pine, and the knobs on them are little forged iron acorns. Margaret found the knobs in a catalog and made me order them, and I grumbled about the price for 2 weeks. And now every time I open a cabinet, I'm glad she made me do it. I touched the windowsill above the sink, just lightly, with 2 fingers. I planned that sill myself on a Saturday afternoon in 1983, while Margaret was at the doctor finding out that she was carrying our daughter Rebecca. I didn't know it then. I just knew the wood was smooth, and the light through the window was warm, and the world felt steady under my feet. A house remembers everything, and so do I. I walked through the front rooms slowly, the way I do most mornings. Not because I'm looking for anything. There's nothing in this house I haven't seen 10,000 times. I walk through because the house likes the company, and because I do too. The front parlor is where Margaret kept her piano. It's still there, an old upright in dark walnut, with the ivory yellowed on the high keys and one pedal that sticks if you don't tap it just right. I haven't had it tuned since the year she died. I told myself for the first 2 years that I would. And then I stopped telling myself anything about it. And now it just sits there, holding the silence. Sometimes I run my hand along the lid, and the wood is cool. And I think about how she used to play hymns on Sunday evenings while I read the paper in the chair by the window. She wasn't a trained pianist. She played by ear, and she missed notes, and she sang along in a voice that was sweeter than it had any right to be. I would give a great deal to hear her miss those notes again. Across from the piano is the chair I built her. It's a rocker, white oak, with a curved back and arms worn smooth by her hands. I made it the year Daniel was born, our first child. The seat is woven rush, and I replaced the rush 3 times over the years, the last time about a month before she passed. I remember her watching me weave it, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea, and saying, "Arthur, this chair is going to outlive both of us." I didn't have a good answer for that. I just kept working. The dining room is to the left of the parlor. The table is a long thing, 8 feet, solid oak, with breadboard ends so it won't cup over time. I built it the second year we lived here. Margaret and I ate every Thanksgiving and every Christmas at that table. And at one point we filled all 8 chairs with our children, and her parents, and my parents, and a handful of folks from church who didn't have anywhere else to go. Those days are over now. The table mostly sits empty, with a cloth runner Margaret made still draped down the middle, and a wooden bowl I turned on a lathe, holding 3 apples that I'll eat over the course of the week. Down the hallway is the staircase. The newel post is a thing I'm quietly proud of. It's a single piece of black walnut, about 8 inches square, with a hand-carved acorn on the top. I worked on that newel post for the better part of 3 Sunday afternoons. Margaret used to put her hand on it every time she came down the stairs. Just touched it, like saying good morning to an old friend. I do the same now. It has become a habit I don't intend to break. At the bottom of the stairs, on the wall to your right as you face the front door, there is a small alcove I built into the framing on purpose. It's about a foot wide, maybe 16 inches tall, and in it there are two things. One is a black and white photograph of Margaret and me on our wedding day, taken on the steps of a little Methodist church in Marshall, North Carolina, in 1978. She is wearing a dress her mother sewed for her, and I am wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right in the shoulders, and we are both laughing at something the photographer said. The other thing in the alcove is my father's trowel. It hangs from a single nail. The handle is wooden, oak, I think, and worn down to a dark shine by my father's hand and then by mine. The blade is steel, pitted in places, but still flat and true. There's a small notch in one corner where my father dropped it on a stone foundation back in the 1950s, and he never bothered to file the notch out. He said the notch reminded him not to drop it again. I have used that trowel on every foundation I ever poured, every chimney I ever built, every stone wall I ever laid up. It has touched more concrete and mortar than any other tool I own. My father gave it to me when I was 9 years old. He didn't say much when he did. He just put it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. There's a story behind it, but it's a long story. And there are some stories a man doesn't tell himself before breakfast. I stood there for a moment, looking at the trowel and the photograph. And the morning sun was just starting to come through the window over the staircase and laid a soft yellow square on the floor at my feet. I thought, as I sometimes do, about how a man's life can be told just as well by his tools as by his words. Maybe better. A tool doesn't lie. It does what you ask of it, no more and no less. And when you set it down, it stays where you left it. I poured myself another cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched a flock of crows lift off the fence line down at the bottom of the pasture. The sun was higher now. The fog was almost gone. The day was getting on with itself, the way days do. I needed to drive into town. I had a few things to pick up at the hardware store, and I'd promised the woman at the post office I'd stop in and sign for a package my son had sent me from Charlotte. Daniel had taken to mailing me things every few months, a sweater one time, a new coffee maker another, once a book about retirement investing that I read 4 pages of and then put on a shelf. I appreciated the gestures, even when I didn't appreciate what came in the box. A son who sends his father things from far away is at least a son who remembers his father is alive. I rinsed my cup, set it upside down on the drain board, and went to get my hat. The road down from Cedar Hill is a narrow thing. Gravel for the first half mile, then patched asphalt the rest of the way to the county road. I drove it slow, the way I always do, because the deer come out of the laurel without warning and because there's no good reason to hurry anymore. My truck is a 1998 Ford, dark green, with a dent in the passenger door from a tree that fell in the storm of 2004. The truck has 231,000 miles on it, and the radio only catches one station clearly, and that station mostly plays old country and weather reports, which suits me fine. Briar Gap sits in a little hollow where 2 creeks come together. It has 1 stoplight, a feed store, a post office, a hardware store, a Methodist church, a Baptist church, a Pentecostal church up the hill behind the school, and a diner called Edna's that has been called Edna's since long before there was an Edna. The current owner is a woman named Patty, who never changed the name because she said you don't change the name of a place people already know how to find. That seemed like wisdom to me. I parked across from the post office and walked over. The bell above the door jingled the same way it has since I was a boy. The woman behind the counter is named Loretta, and she's about my age, and she went to high school with Margaret. She slid the package across the counter without me asking, because that's how a town like this works. She knew my name was on it before I did. It was a small package, soft, probably another sweater. I tucked it under my arm and thanked her, and she asked after my health, and I said the knees were complaining, but the rest was holding up. She laughed, and I laughed, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The hardware store is 2 doors down. I needed a box of 3-inch deck screws and a tube of roofing tar for a small repair I wanted to make before the rains came. The man who runs the hardware store is named Earl, and he's been there since I was framing my first house. Earl is about 70, bald as a stone, with hands like catcher's mitts. He doesn't say much, but he knows every screw and every nail in his store by feel. When I came in, Earl was sitting behind the counter reading a fishing magazine. He looked up, nodded, and went back to his article. I walked to the back of the store, found what I needed, and brought it up front. Earl rang me up without looking at the register too closely, because he has done it 10,000 times, and the prices are in his head. He said, "Storm coming." I said, "I heard that." He said, "They're saying it could turn ugly, could come up off the Gulf and curl back over the mountains." I said, "We've seen those before." He said, Some of us are building houses now like the storms don't happen anymore." I knew what he meant. There was no need to answer. I paid him in cash, took my bag, and went on. I had one more stop before going home. Edna's Diner sits on the corner across from the courthouse, and on a Tuesday morning around 10 o'clock, you can find Henry Caldwell there in the second booth from the back, with a cup of coffee and the local paper folded open to the obituaries. Henry reads the obituaries every morning. He says he wants to make sure he isn't in them. Henry is 68, 3 years older than me. He worked alongside me for 26 years. He was the best framer I ever saw, with an eye for a plumb line that didn't need a level to confirm it. When his knees gave out, the county hired him as a building inspector, and he spent the last 15 years of his working life going through other men's work with the same care he used to put into his own. He retired the year before I did. We have been friends since the summer we were 11 years old and got caught fishing in a pond we were not supposed to be fishing in. I slid into the booth across from him, and he looked up over his reading glasses. He said, "You're early." I said, "You're predictable." He smiled and folded the paper. Patty came over with the coffee pot and filled a cup for me without asking, because some things in a small town do not require asking. We sat there for a while in the comfortable quiet of 2 men who do not need to fill every minute with talk. Henry asked about the house. I told him it was holding up fine. He asked if I'd seen the new development going in on the south side of town, the one out past where the lumber mill used to be. I told him I'd driven past it the week before, on my way to a doctor's appointment over in Hendersonville. Henry shook his head slowly. He said, "Arthur, you should see what they're doing out there. They're laying footings in clay without any drainage. They're using engineered lumber rated for residential, but only just barely, on spans I wouldn't trust in a tool shed. They're roofing with 20-year asphalt on a slope that needs metal." He paused. They're selling them for $800,000 apiece. I said, "To who?" He said, "To folks from out of state. Mostly people who don't know what to look for. People who see a big kitchen and a granite countertop and figure that means the house is solid." I drank my coffee. Henry said, "I went out there in May on a private inspection for a fellow from Florida who'd already signed papers, just to see. I told him to walk away. I don't know if he did." I said, "Earl was just saying something about that, about people building like the storms don't happen anymore." Henry said, "They don't think they happen anymore. That's the thing. They think weather is a problem we solved, like polio." He shook his head. "Arthur, in this hollow, in our lifetime, we have seen a flood take out half a town. We have seen wind peel the roof off a brick school. We have seen a creek that's 2 feet deep in July come up to a man's neck in October, and people are building like none of that ever happened." I didn't answer. There was nothing to add. Henry looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You're a quiet kind of worried this morning. Something on your mind." I said, "Daniel called last night." Henry waited. I said, "He wants to come up next weekend. Said the whole family wants to come." He said, "To talk about a few important things." Henry nodded slowly. He did not need me to explain what that meant. He had been a father long enough to know what it sounded like when grown children started talking about important things. He said only, "Well, we'll see what comes of it." I said, "We will." We finished our coffee. I left a few bills on the table. We walked out into the late morning sun together and parted at the corner. He went west, toward his little brick house behind the Methodist church. I went east, toward my truck and Cedar Hill, and whatever was coming. I took the long way home. I don't always, but that morning I did, because Henry's words were sitting on me, and I wanted some time to think before I climbed back up the hill. The long way takes you out past the old lumber mill, then north on Route 14 for about 3 miles, then a left onto a county road that winds along the ridge before it drops down towards Cedar Hill from the north side. It adds about 20 minutes to the trip. It's a pretty drive in the fall. About a mile past the lumber mill, on a piece of land that used to be a dairy farm when I was a boy, there's now a development called Whispering Ridge. That's the place Henry was talking about. I slowed the truck as I came up to it, just enough to look without seeming to stare. There were maybe 15 houses already up, and the bones of 10 or 12 more going in. They were big houses, all of them. 3,000 square feet or more, with 2-car garages and arched entryways and stone veneer on the front-facing walls. The stone veneer was the part that struck me. It wasn't real stone. It was a thin product, glued to a fiberboard backer, made to look like field stone from a distance. From the road it almost passed. Up close, you would have known immediately. The roofs were asphalt shingles in a color that was supposed to look like slate. The slopes were shallow, too shallow for this part of the state, where snow can pile up overnight and where rain comes down sideways in October. The driveways were poured concrete, but I could see from the road that they had no expansion joints cut into them, which meant they would crack inside of 3 winters. What bothered me most, though, was what I couldn't see. The footings, the drainage, the grading. I had driven past this development back in May, when they were just starting to dig. I had seen the trenches they were calling footings. I had seen the rebar, what little there was of it laid in. I had seen the trucks come and pour concrete onto ground that had not been properly compacted, in weather that was wetter than it should have been for a pour. I had not said anything to anyone. It was not my project. It was not my place. But I had driven home that day with a tightness in my chest that I had not been able to name for several hours. And when I had finally named it, the word had been sorrow. Because these were not bad men building these houses. I knew some of them. The crews were local. The foremen were trying to keep their families fed. But the developers were pushing them on speed, pushing them on cost, pushing them to skip the things that don't show. Because the things that don't show don't sell. And the people buying these houses didn't know what they didn't know. They walked through the model home and looked at the kitchen island and the spa bathroom and the walk-in closet, and they signed the papers. They believed, the way Henry had said, that weather was a problem somebody else had solved. I drove past Whispering Ridge slowly, and I thought about my own house up on the hill, and the difference between the two struck me with a kind of sadness that surprised me. When I built Cedar Hill, back in the early 80s, I did not build it to impress anybody. I did not build it to flip it. I did not build it to be the biggest house on the ridge or the prettiest one from the road. I built it to last. I dug the footings 4 feet deep instead of the required 3, because I knew the freeze line in this part of the mountains can shift in a cold year. I doubled the bottom plate. I used real rebar, 1/2 inch, set in a proper grid. In concrete, I mixed to a specific gravel ratio I had learned from an old engineer named McNally over in Black Mountain, who had built bridges for the state in the 1940s. I tied the framing down to the foundation with hurricane straps, long before the code in this county required them. I cross-braced the attic the way my father had taught me to brace a barn, on the assumption that the wind would, sooner or later, try to take the roof off, and that it was my job to make sure it didn't. I had built Cedar Hill, in other words, the way my father had taught me to build, and the way his father had taught him. And neither of them, as I would think about more than once in the days that followed, had built the house I grew up in. I came down off the ridge from the north side and turned onto my own gravel drive a little before noon. The driveway curves up through a stand of white oaks that Margaret planted as saplings the second year we lived here. From acorns she gathered in her apron pocket on a walk one autumn morning. They are tall now, those oaks. They make a kind of green tunnel over the drive in the summer, and a yellow one in the fall. I drove through that tunnel slowly. I always do. When the house came into view at the top of the hill, I felt the same thing I have felt every time I have come home to it for nearly 40 years. It is hard to put into words. It is something like relief, and something like gratitude, and something like the feeling of putting on a coat you forgot you owned in a winter you didn't expect. I parked the truck under the carport on the north side of the house, and I sat there for a moment with the engine off, just looking. The porch railing needed paint on the west-facing side. The gutter over the kitchen had pulled loose at one bracket. A few of the metal roof panels could use a wipe down where the pollen had settled in the seams. I made a mental list, the way I always do. The list never gets shorter. It is part of the conversation a man has with a house he built. I went inside and put my package from Daniel on the kitchen table without opening it. I made myself a sandwich, ham and cheddar on bread from the bakery in town, and ate it standing up at the counter. Then I went out to the workshop behind the house, because I did my best thinking out there. And there was thinking to be done. The workshop is a small frame building, maybe 20 feet by 24. I built it the year after I built the house. The walls are full of tools hanging from pegboards, leaning in corners, lined up on shelves I cut and sanded myself. There is a wood stove in one corner and a workbench down the middle, and the smell in there is the same as it has been for 35 years: sawdust, machine oil, and the faint sweetness of old pine. I sat down on the stool at the workbench and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. Daniel was coming up next weekend. He was bringing the whole family. He wanted to talk about important things. I had a feeling, sitting there with my hands resting on the worn pine of the bench, that I knew what those important things were going to be. And I had a feeling, too, that I was going to have to be ready for them in a way I had not yet figured out how to be. The trowel was still on its nail in the hallway, inside the house. But out here, in the quiet of the shop, I could almost feel its weight in my hand, the way I had felt it the day my father put it there. The week wore on in the way weeks do when a man is waiting for something he isn't looking forward to. I kept busy. I patched the loose gutter over the kitchen. I scraped and primed the section of railing that needed paint. I split a half cord of firewood and stacked it against the north wall of the shop, because the almanac was calling for a long winter, and I trust the almanac more than I trust the television. In the evenings, I sat in the parlor with a book open in my lap and didn't always read it. I would catch myself staring at the piano, or at the empty rocking chair, or at the photograph in the alcove. Margaret had been gone 7 years that summer. 7 years is a long time, and a short time, and both at once. She had known the children better than I did. That was one of the truths I had come to in the years since she passed. A father knows his children one way, the practical way, the providing way, the way that watches them from across the dinner table and gauges whether they have what they need. A mother knows them differently. A mother knows the inside of them. Margaret had known the inside of Daniel and Rebecca in ways I had only ever seen from the outside. And when she died, I had lost not only my wife, but also my translator. After that, I had to learn my own children all over again. On my own. I had not always done well at it. Daniel was 38 that fall. He lived in Charlotte. He was a commercial real estate developer, which meant he put up office buildings and shopping plazas in places where farmland used to be. He had done well at it. He drove a German car and wore shirts that needed dry cleaning, and carried himself like a man who had been told he was important often enough to start believing it. He had a wife named Catherine and no children, which was a sore spot in the family that none of us talked about anymore. He had been a thoughtful boy once. He had liked to take things apart on the kitchen floor: radios, alarm clocks, an old toaster, and put them back together with the tip of his tongue stuck out the corner of his mouth. Somewhere between then and now, he had stopped being interested in how things worked and become interested only in what they were worth. I could not point to the year that had happened. It had happened slowly, the way most important things do. Rebecca was 35. She lived in Raleigh, in a new subdivision called Magnolia Park, where every house looked like every other house, only with the shutters painted a different color. She worked in marketing for a company that sold something I had never quite gotten clear on what. Her husband Tom worked in finance. They had 2 children. Hannah was 12, a quiet, watchful girl who reminded me powerfully of her grandmother, and Caleb was 9, a fearless little boy who climbed things he was not supposed to climb and asked me questions I did not always know how to answer. Rebecca had been my buddy when she was small. She had followed me out to the shop when she was 4 years old and sat on a 5-gallon bucket and watched me work for an hour at a stretch. Just watched. Not even talking. Content to be near her father. She had ridden along on job sites in the summers when she was a teenager, and she had been the one to bring me coffee in a thermos and the one to ask me sharp questions about why I did things the way I did them. She had cared about the answers. Then, she had cared about the houses I built and the people I built them for. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped caring about the houses and started caring about the addresses. I could not point to the year that had happened either. I did not blame either of them. I knew enough about the world to know that children grow into the soil they're planted in. And Margaret and I had planted ours in good soil, but had not been able to follow them when they had transplanted themselves to other ground. They had become who they had become. That was the simplest way to say it. But I had been a builder all my life, and a builder does not stop thinking about foundations just because his children have moved into houses other men built. I had watched the way the wind blew in Charlotte and Raleigh, and I had not liked what I had seen. On Thursday evening, I sat in the parlor and opened the package Daniel had sent. It was a sweater, like I had guessed a heavy gray wool cardigan from some catalog out of Vermont, the kind of thing a man wears in a photograph. The price tag was still on the inside. He had not bothered to take it off. The price was more than I had ever spent on any single piece of clothing in my life. I folded it back up and put it in the drawer where I kept the sweaters Margaret had bought me, the ones I still wore. The phone rang then. It was a Thursday, just past 7 o'clock. I picked it up in the kitchen. It was Daniel. He had a way of opening a phone call that made you feel like you were already running late to something. He said, "Dad, listen. Just confirming for Saturday. Catherine and I are driving up Friday night. We'll get to the house around 9. Rebecca and Tom and the kids are coming Saturday morning. We figured we'd do an early dinner Saturday, say 4 o'clock, and then we can sit down after and talk through everything." I said, "Talk through what?" "Daniel." There was a small pause. He said, "Just some family things. Long-term planning. Nothing to worry about." "Dad, we just want to be on the same page." I said, "On the same page about what?" He said, "Dad, let's just save it for when we're all together. It'll be easier face to face." "Okay." I said, "All right." He said, "Great. Catherine sends her love. Talk to you Friday." He hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand for a moment, and then I set it back in its cradle on the wall. The kitchen was dim. I had not turned the overhead light on. The only light in the room was the small lamp over the stove, and it threw a soft yellow circle on the floor at my feet. I walked out into the hallway. The trowel was where it had always been, on its nail beside the wedding photograph. The blade caught what little light there was and held it. I looked at the trowel for a long time. I thought about my father, and about his father, and about the house my grandfather had lived in and died in, the one I had been inside of when I was 9 years old, the one that was not there anymore. I thought about Margaret, and about a promise I had made her in the last week of her life. Sitting beside her bed with her hand in mine. A promise I had not told anyone else about and did not intend to. Outside, the wind had come up a little. It moved through the white oaks on the drive and made a sound like the house was breathing. I went upstairs to bed earlier than usual. I lay in the dark for a long time before I slept. I was not afraid. A man who has framed houses in February storms and dug graves for his own dog in his own backyard is not easily afraid. But I was alert in a way I had not been in a long while. The way an animal becomes alert when the wind shifts. Something was coming up the hill toward me. I was going to be ready when it got here. Daniel and Catherine arrived Friday night at 9:05, which for Daniel was practically early. I heard the car before I saw it, the low, expensive hum of a German engine working its way up the gravel drive, and the soft crunch of tires on stone that always sounded different from my old truck. I was sitting on the porch with the light off, just rocking, with a glass of water on the railing beside me. I had not turned on the porch light because I wanted to see the headlights coming up through the oaks. The headlights swept across the trees and then across the front of the house, and the car stopped at the edge of the drive. The engine cut. 2 doors opened, then closed. I heard Catherine's voice, low and tired, and Daniel's voice answering her, brisk even after a 4-hour drive. I stood up and walked to the top of the porch steps and turned on the light. Daniel came up the steps first, with a small suitcase in one hand and his car keys in the other. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat that probably cost more than my truck. He set the suitcase down and gave me one of those quick half hugs that men give each other when they are not sure what kind of greeting is called for. He said, "Dad, you look good." I said, "So do you, son." It wasn't quite true, what I said. He looked tired around the eyes in a way I had not seen before. There was a tightness in his jaw that I recognized from the last year of my own working life. When I had been carrying jobs I couldn't quite finish on time. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. A father learns when to notice and when to speak, and the gap between the two is sometimes longer than you'd think. Catherine came up the steps next. She is a tall, slender woman with hair the color of dark honey, cut sharp at the shoulders. She works in some kind of consulting business. I have known her for 11 years, and I still couldn't tell you exactly what she does for a living. She hugged me the way she always does, lightly, with one hand on my back and the other holding her purse. And she said, "Arthur, it is so good to see you." I said, "You too. Catherine, come on inside. I've got coffee on." We went into the kitchen. Catherine set her purse on the counter and looked around the room with the polite half-smile of a woman in a place she did not consider hers. She has been in my kitchen many times over the years. Each time, she looks at it the same way, like a museum exhibit she's not entirely sure she's supposed to touch. Daniel set his suitcase by the back stairs. He walked to the window over the sink and looked out into the dark, and I could see his reflection in the glass. Faint and ghostly. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, and then he turned around and clapped his hands together once, lightly. He said, "So, long drive. Catherine's exhausted. We're going to head up to bed, if that's all right with you. Dad, we can catch up properly in the morning." I said, "That's fine. The guest room is made up, You know where the towels are." Catherine kissed me on the cheek and went up the stairs. Daniel hung back for a moment in the kitchen. He picked up an apple from the wooden bowl on the counter and turned it over in his hand, looking at it without really seeing it. He said, "Dad, I just want to say tomorrow, when everybody's here, just hear us out." "Okay, that's all I'm asking. We've been doing a lot of thinking, and we just want to share it with you. Nobody's trying to push you into anything." I looked at him for a moment. He met my eyes and then looked back down at the apple. I said, "I'll listen. Daniel, I always listen." He nodded. He set the apple back in the bowl, gently, and went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The clock on the stove said 9:23. The house was quiet except for the soft tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional groan of the timbers settling for the night. Nobody's trying to push you into anything. That was the kind of sentence a man uses when he is about to push you into something. I knew it because I had heard 1,000 subcontractors say versions of the same sentence over the years. Right before they tried to talk me into a corner I wasn't going to back into, I poured what was left of the coffee into the sink, washed the pot, set it upside down on the drain board, and turned out the light. I climbed the stairs slowly, the way I do now. The newel post was cool under my hand. I touched it the way Margaret used to. Then I went down the hall to my bedroom, and I lay in the dark for a long time before I finally slept. In my dream, I was 9 years old again, standing in the yard of my grandfather's house in the rain. I had not had that dream in many years. Rebecca and Tom and the children arrived Saturday morning at 10:15. I heard their van pull up while I was out in the workshop sharpening a chisel I didn't really need to sharpen. I had been out there since 6. A man does what he does with his hands when his mind is too full for anything else. I came around the side of the house wiping my hands on a shop rag, and Hannah was already out of the van and standing in the driveway with her arms wrapped around herself, looking up at the oaks. She is 12, tall for her age, with her mother's dark hair and her grandmother's eyes, those quiet eyes that take in more than they let on. She saw me before anyone else did, and her face lit up in a way that made my chest tighten. She came running across the gravel and hugged me around the middle. She said, "Grandpa." I said, "Hannah girl." I bent down and kissed the top of her head. She still smelled like the strawberry shampoo Rebecca used to buy her when she was little, even though she was getting too old for it now. Caleb came barreling out of the back seat next. He is 9, all elbows and energy, with a gap in his front teeth and a permanently scraped knee. He didn't bother with a hug. He ran straight past me toward the back of the house, hollering something about a chipmunk he had seen the last time he was here and wanting to know if it was still around. I let him go. There's no holding a boy like that, and there's no reason to try. Tom got out of the driver's side. He's a decent man, my son-in-law. He's not someone I would have picked for Rebecca, but he treats her well, and he treats the children well, and that's enough for me to make peace with the rest. He's tall, thin, with a receding hairline he's stopped trying to hide. He works in finance, which means, as far as I can tell, that he moves other people's money from one place to another and takes a small piece of it each time it passes through his hands. He walked over and shook my hand firmly. He said, "Arthur, good to see you." I said. You too. Tom. Drive up all right. He said, traffic on 240 was a nightmare. But we made it. Rebecca came around the front of the van last. She was wearing a long, camel-colored coat and dark jeans and boots that looked like they had never touched mud. Her hair was pulled back into a low knot at the base of her neck. She looked tired the way Daniel had looked tired the night before. That same tightness around the eyes, but on her it was harder to see, because she was wearing makeup that had been carefully applied to hide it. She came up to me and put her arms around my neck and held on for a second longer than I expected her to. When she pulled back, she said, "Hi, Daddy." She had not called me Daddy in a long time. Years, maybe. Dad, usually. Father. When she was annoyed. Daddy was a word from when she was small. I said, "Hi, sweetheart." I helped Tom carry the bags inside. The children had already disappeared somewhere into the back of the property. I could hear Caleb yelling something from the direction of the creek, and Hannah's quieter voice answering him. Catherine came down the stairs in jeans and a soft sweater, and she and Rebecca did the kind of half-hug that women do when they like each other well enough, but aren't truly close. Daniel was on his phone in the parlor, pacing in front of the cold fireplace. He held up one finger toward Rebecca as a kind of greeting, the way a man does when he is in the middle of an important call. I went out to the back porch and stood for a minute, just breathing. The morning had warmed up. The sun was high enough now to clear the ridge to the east, and it was falling across the back pasture in long, gold-colored sheets. Down at the bottom of the slope, near where the creek bends. I could see Caleb crouched beside a flat rock with Hannah standing behind him, both of them focused on something in the grass. A chipmunk, probably. A salamander. Some small living thing. I thought, for a moment, about how the children had not yet been told what the day was about. They were just being children, on their grandfather's land, on a Saturday morning in September. Whatever happened later, that hour was theirs, and it was real. I went back inside. We had lunch together in the dining room. I had set the table the night before Margaret's good plates, the cloth napkins. The bowl of apples in the center moved to a sideboard. Catherine had brought a salad in a glass bowl from a fancy market in Charlotte. Rebecca had brought a loaf of crusty bread and a wedge of cheese. I had made a pot of beef stew the day before, the way Margaret used to make it, with carrots and parsnips and a glass of red wine poured into the pot, and I had warmed it on the back of the stove that morning. The children ate fast. Caleb told a long story about a fish he had caught in a pond at a friend's birthday party, and the story grew bigger as he told it. The way stories do when you're 9. Hannah corrected him a few times, gently, and he ignored her, the way little brothers do. The adults laughed in the right places. Daniel told a story about a building in Charlotte that had been on the cover of a magazine. Tom told a story about a colleague who had retired at 52 to go sail around the Caribbean. I listened more than I talked. That is something I have always done. After lunch, Catherine and Rebecca cleared the dishes and started the coffee. Tom took the children outside to walk the property. Daniel went into the parlor to make another phone call. I stayed at the table for a moment, looking at the empty chairs and the cloth runner and the wooden bowl, and I felt, very quietly, the way I sometimes feel when I am in this room, like the people who were missing were not just absent, but watching. Margaret, my father, her parents, The folks from church who used to fill those chairs. I thought, this is the last meal in this room before whatever is coming comes. I was right about that, though not in the way I expected. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the children were back at the van, watching a movie on a small screen Rebecca had set up for them in the back seat. Tom was on the porch checking his email. The light was just starting to shift the way it does in late September, when the afternoon turns from gold to amber and the shadows get long. Daniel came into the kitchen, where I was rinsing coffee cups, and he said, "Dad, let's go ahead and sit down. Catherine, Rebecca, can you come in here?" There it was, the tone in his voice. The same tone he had used on the phone Thursday night. The tone of a man who had already had this meeting in his head and was now ready to have it out loud. We sat in the parlor. I took my chair by the window, the wing chair Margaret had bought me at an estate sale in Marshall the year before she died. Daniel sat on the sofa with Catherine beside him. Rebecca took the rocking chair. Margaret's chair, which I noticed but did not say anything about. She did not seem to know what chair it was. I let that pass too. Daniel opened a leather portfolio he had brought down from upstairs. Inside it were typed pages, a folder marked with a real estate firm's name in Charlotte, and a small spiral notebook. He took out the typed pages and laid them face down on the coffee table. He said, "Dad, I'm just going to be direct, because I know you appreciate that. We, Rebecca and I, and Catherine and Tom, we've been talking for the better part of a year now about your situation here at Cedar Hill, and we've come to some conclusions we want to share with you." He paused, the way men do when they want you to say go on. I didn't say go on. I just looked at him. He kept going. He said, "Dad, this house is too big for one man. It's 2,800 square feet on 2 acres of cleared property and another 7 acres of woods. You're keeping it up by yourself, and you're doing a good job. But the truth is, you're 65 and you're not going to be able to do this forever. The driveway alone, when there's ice, it's not safe. The roof is going to need replacing in the next 10 years. The septic system is original to the house. We've looked into it." I said, "You've looked into it?" He said, "Yes. We had a friend in the inspection business take a look at the public records, just so we'd know what we were working with." He said the word friend, the way some people say the word convenient. He went on. He said, "Dad, here's the thing. This land is worth a lot of money. More than you know. The county has rezoned the parcels above and below yours for residential development. Whispering Ridge is just the beginning. In the next 5 years, this whole ridge is going to be subdivisions. The value of this property right now, at this moment, is the highest it has ever been, and it's the highest it is likely to be for a long time, maybe ever." He picked up the folder from the real estate firm and slid it across the table toward me. He said, "We've had 2 valuations done, conservative and aggressive. The conservative number is 1.6 million. The aggressive number is 2.1. We're confident we could get somewhere in the middle. Call it 1.8. He sat back. I could feel Catherine watching me, and Rebecca watching me. And I could hear the clock in the hallway and the soft, tinny voice of the children's movie out in the van. I did not open the folder. I let it sit on the table between us. I said, "And then what?" Daniel said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You sell it for 1.8 million. Then what? Where do I live?" Daniel said, "Dad, that's the best part. We've already started looking. There's a beautiful new community outside of Asheville called Mountain Brook. It's a 55-plus community, brand new construction, single-floor units, maintenance included. There's a clubhouse, a fitness center, walking trails. You'd be 20 minutes from Henderson, 25 from Asheville. We could get you a 3-bedroom unit for around $450,000. That leaves the rest of the proceeds to be invested or distributed." Distributed. He kept going, but I had caught the word. And the word had landed somewhere in my chest, the way a splinter does, small and sharp, and not immediately removable. He said, "Catherine and I have spoken with a financial planner. The proceeds, properly invested, would generate income for the rest of your life and still leave a meaningful inheritance for Rebecca and me. It's a way of taking care of you and taking care of the next generation at the same time. It's the responsible thing. Dad, it really is." He stopped talking. He waited. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Rebecca. I said, "Rebecca, what do you think?" She had been quiet through the whole speech. She had her hands folded in her lap and her boots crossed at the ankle. She did not look at me right away. She looked at the floor, then at Daniel, then, finally, at me. She said, "Dad, I think Daniel is right." She said it softly, but she said it. She said, "I've been worrying about you for a long time, living up here alone, all the way out from town. What happens if you fall? What happens if there's a storm? You don't even have a cell phone signal half the time. And the kids, I want the kids to be able to see you more. They love you, but it's a 4-hour drive, and we can only do it a few times a year. If you were in Mountain Brook, we could see you every month." She paused. Then she said the sentence I would remember. She said, "Dad, holding on to this old house, it's a kind of selfishness. You know it is. You're keeping it because you don't want to let go of Mom. And I understand that. I do. But you can't stay in the past forever. There are people in the present who need you, too." The room got very quiet. I felt, in that moment, 2 things at once. The first was a sorrow I cannot describe, because the word my daughter had used was selfishness, and that word, in her mouth, in this room, in this chair her mother used to rock our children in, was almost too much for me to hold. The second was a kind of clarity, a cold clarity, but a clear one. I understood, in that moment, that my children had come up the hill to take this house from me, and that they did not see it as taking. They saw it as helping. And the gap between what they saw and what was true was a gap I could not close in one afternoon, no matter what I said. I sat for a long time without speaking. Daniel started to say something to fill the silence, and I lifted my hand, just slightly, and he stopped. I said, "Finally, I'd like to think about it." Daniel said, "Of course, Dad. Take your time. We were thinking we'd come back up next Saturday, same time. Same setup. We can sign papers then if you're ready. We've already got a buyer lined up who's willing to move fast, and the timing on the rezoning is the—" I said, "I'd like to think about it." He stopped. He nodded. He said, "Of course." I stood up. My knees popped, the way they do. I walked out of the parlor and down the hallway, and I passed the alcove with the trowel and the wedding photograph without looking at either of them. Because if I had looked, I am not sure what I would have done. I went out the back door and onto the porch and down the steps and into the yard, and I kept walking until I was halfway down the slope toward the creek. And then I stopped, and I stood there in the long amber light. And I did not cry. But I came close. Selfishness. I stood in the grass for a long time, and the sun went down behind the ridge, and the air began to cool, and after a while I heard the van doors slam and the engine start, and I heard Rebecca's voice calling my name from the porch. Calling Dad, calling Dad. We're heading out, and I did not answer her. I just stood in the grass with my back to the house and listened to my daughter call me from a porch I had built. And after a few minutes, the calling stopped, and the van pulled out of the drive, and I was alone on my hill again. I did not sleep much Saturday night. I lay in bed with the window cracked open, listening to the wind in the oaks, and I went over the afternoon again and again in my head. Not the words I remembered just fine. What I went over was the look on Rebecca's face when she had said the word selfishness. There had been no malice in her face. That was the part that cut deepest. She had said it the way you would say a hard truth to a child, gently, with the certainty that you were doing him a kindness. That was the part Margaret would have understood. And I did not. Margaret had always said that the people who hurt you the most are the people who are most sure they are helping. Daniel and Catherine had stayed Saturday night, but they had eaten dinner in town with Rebecca's family before driving back up the hill. They had come in late, around 10, and gone straight to bed. I had been in my room with the light off by then, not asleep, but not wanting to talk either. I heard their door close. I heard Catherine say something low and tired. I heard Daniel answer her, and then the house was quiet. Sunday morning. I was up before 5. I made coffee in the kitchen and drank it standing at the window over the sink, watching the dark turn slowly to gray and then to a kind of pearl color that promised a clear day. I felt thin. That's the only word I have for it. Like a piece of wood that's been sanded for too long. Around 6:30, I heard the back door open quietly. Daniel came out onto the porch in his coat with a coffee cup of his own. He had filled it from the pot I'd left on. He stood at the railing and looked out toward the valley, and I watched him from inside the kitchen for a moment before I joined him. We stood there for a while without talking. The sky was getting lighter. A truck passed on the county road down below, the sound carrying up the hill the way sound does in cold air. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at it, and frowned. He glanced back at the kitchen door at me, and I stepped back from the window. He didn't see me. He walked off the porch and down the back steps and out into the yard, far enough to be out of earshot of the house. He turned his back to me and put the phone to his ear. I am not in the habit of listening to other people's conversations. I want that on the record. But the kitchen window above the sink was cracked open an inch. Margaret had always cracked it to let the steam out when she made breakfast, and I had never broken the habit. And the morning was very still, and my son had walked just far enough away to feel private, but not nearly far enough to be private. I heard pieces. I heard him say, "Marcus, Listen, I told you. I'm working on it. I heard him say, he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He said he wanted to think about it. That's better than I expected. I heard him say, yeah, the parcel above and below already, plus the 7 acres. We could do 20 units easy, maybe 24. I heard him say, no, the house comes down. There's no scenario where the house stays. The pad we'd need for the access road runs right through the kitchen. The house comes down. I heard him say, I know. Marcus, I know. Look, my loan situation. I don't have to tell you about. I've got till the end of next month before things get ugly. If we can close on this by the middle of October, I'm clear. If we can't, I'm not, I heard him say, he'll come around. He's a reasonable man. He just needs to feel like it was his idea. Then he laughed. A short laugh, not a happy one. And he said, yeah, okay. I'll let you know Monday. He hung up. He stood in the yard for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking out at the oaks. Then he came back up the steps and into the kitchen. I had turned away from the window by then. I was at the stove, stirring something in a pan that didn't need stirring. He didn't know I had heard. He came in, refilled his coffee, said something about how cold the morning was, and went to wake Catherine. I stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in my hand, and I did not move for a long time. The eggs in the pan went past where I wanted them to be and started to brown. I scraped them onto a plate. I sat down at the kitchen table. I did not eat them. The house comes down. That was the thing. I had been thinking, since the meeting the day before, that we were talking about a sale, that the disagreement was about whether or not I should move, that the question was at its heart whether I was being asked to leave or whether I was being asked to stay. I had been preparing myself, in the back of my mind, to think hard about Rebecca's words, to wonder honestly whether she might be right, to consider, in the cold light of morning, whether my refusal was about Margaret, about the past, about my own stubbornness. But the conversation I had not been part of, the one happening in another state between my son and a man named Marcus, was not about whether the house would stand or fall. That had already been decided. The house was coming down. The driveway, the porch, the chimney made of stones from the creek. The windowsill I had planed the afternoon Margaret was carrying Rebecca, the newel post with the carved acorn, the alcove with my father's trowel, all of it. Gone. To make room for an access road and 24 houses with stone veneer glued to fiberboard. And my son had a deadline. He had a loan situation. He needed this to close by the middle of October. I sat at the table and I felt, for a moment, something I had not felt in a long time. It was not anger. Anger is a hot thing, and what I felt was cold. It was not heartbreak exactly, though it was close. It was the feeling a man gets when he has been looking at a wall in his own house for 40 years and suddenly realizes it isn't load-bearing the way he thought it was. It was the feeling of a foundation shifting beneath you. Daniel and Catherine came down for breakfast around 8. I put the burnt eggs in the trash and made fresh ones. I served them with bacon and toast and coffee, and I sat across from my son, and I made small talk about the weather and about a bridge they were repairing on the way back to Charlotte. He did not notice anything different in me. He told me, as they were putting their bags in the car, that he would see me in a week, that he would call midweek to check in, that he loved me, and he hoped I was thinking about everything carefully. I told him I was thinking about everything carefully. That part was true. He hugged me. Catherine hugged me. They got in the car. They drove away. I stood on the porch and watched them go down through the oaks, and when the car was out of sight, I sat down on the top step and I put my face in my hands. I sat like that for a long time. When I finally got up, I went into the hallway. I took the trowel down off its nail. I held it in my hand the way my father had held it, and the way my grandfather had held it before him. I went into the kitchen, and I picked up the phone, and I called Henry Caldwell. I said, "Henry, I need to come see you. I need to come today." Henry said, "You all right, Arthur?" I said, "I'm all right. But there's some work to be done." Henry said, "Come on then." I hung up. I put the trowel back on its nail. I got my hat and my keys, and I went down the hill into Briar Gap. Henry's house sits on a quiet street behind the Methodist church. It's a small brick ranch he and his wife Dorothy bought back in 1976, and he has lived there alone since Dorothy passed about 10 years ago. The yard is neat. The flower beds are mulched. There is a wooden bench under a redbud tree by the front walk, and Henry was sitting on it when I pulled up, the way he often is on a Sunday morning, watching the sparrows. He stood up when he saw the truck. He didn't say anything. He just waved me into the house, and I followed him in. Henry's kitchen is the kitchen of a man who lives alone and is at peace with it. A single cup turned upside down on the drain board, a small radio on the windowsill, tuned low to a gospel station, a photograph of Dorothy on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet from a tire shop in Asheville. We sat at his table, and he poured me coffee from a percolator that was older than my truck. I told him everything. I told him about the meeting in the parlor on Saturday. I told him about Rebecca and the words she had used. I told him about Daniel's call to the man named Marcus, and the loan situation, and the access road, and the 24 units. I told him about the deadline of the middle of October. I told him about how Daniel had laughed and said, "He just needs to feel like it was his idea." Henry listened. He did not interrupt me once. When I was done, he sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. He said, "Arthur, I'm sorry." I said, "Don't be sorry. I'm not asking for sorry." He said, "I know you're not." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you asking for?" I said, "I'm asking for help thinking. I'm not going to sell." Henry, I knew that walking out of my own parlor yesterday afternoon. I knew it before I knew anything else. But I'm not going to fight my son in a courtroom, and I'm not going to scream at my daughter, and I'm not going to act like a wounded animal. I need to find another way. Henry said, "Another way to do what?" I said, "To tell them the truth in a way they have to hear." Henry was quiet for a long moment. He stirred his coffee with a spoon, even though he takes it black. It was an old habit of his. From when he was thinking, he said, "Arthur, you know what I think of that house. I've inspected it, off the books, twice. Once when you put the metal roof on, Once when you redid the foundation drainage. I know what's in those walls. I know what's under that floor. I know what you did with that chimney. There is not, to my knowledge, a single residential structure built in this county in the last 40 years that is more solid than yours. Not one. I said, I know. He said, have your children ever seen any of that? I said, no. He said, why not? I sat with that question for a moment. It was a good question. It was the kind of question Henry was good at, the kind that doesn't accuse you, but doesn't let you off the hook either. I said, because I never thought I needed to. I thought they grew up in it. I thought they knew. Henry said, Arthur, children know what their fathers tell them. They don't know what their fathers don't tell them. You and I grew up in a generation that thought a man's work spoke for itself. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you've got to walk a person through the work and say, here, look at this. This is what it means. I drank my coffee. I said, so you're telling me to show them? He said, I'm telling you. If you want them to understand what they're asking you to tear down, you have to put it in front of them in a way they can't argue with. You can't out-talk Daniel. Nobody can out-talk Daniel. You don't have to out-talk him. You have to out-document him. I said, how? Henry set his cup down. He said, you've got the original blueprints. I said, in the file cabinet in the workshop. He said, you've got the engineering calculations McNally did for the foundation. I said, in the same drawer. He said, you've got the receipts and the materials lists from the framing and the roofing. I said, most of them, in a banker's box in the attic. He said, you've got the soil report from when you graded the lot. I said, yes. McNally's son did that for me, the one who took over the firm. Henry said, all right. Then here's what we do. We put together a folder, not a fancy folder, a simple one, the blueprints, the engineering, the materials. We add an updated structural assessment. I'll do it myself. No charge. And I'll sign it as a retired county inspector. We add a comparison. We pull the public records on Whispering Ridge, the permits, the inspections, the variances they were granted for shortcuts. We put your house next to that development on paper, line by line. We make it impossible to look at and not see. I said, Henry, I don't want to embarrass my son. Henry said, Arthur, your son is trying to take a hammer to your life's work to cover his own bad investments. I'd say a little embarrassment is the cheapest medicine on the shelf. I sat with that. I said, I don't want to do this out of anger. He said, I know you don't. That's why I'm helping you. Anyone else. I might say let them have it, but you're going to do this with a steady hand. You're going to lay it all out, calmly, the way you laid out the footings on that house. And then you're going to leave the rest to them. I nodded slowly. I said, there's something else. He said, what? I said, there's something Margaret asked me before she died. Something I haven't told anyone. I'd been planning to do something about it for a long time, but I kept putting it off. After yesterday, I'm not putting it off anymore. I need to talk to a lawyer. I need to set something up that can't be undone." Henry looked at me for a long moment, and I think he understood, or partly understood. He didn't ask me to explain. That was Henry. He never asked for more than you offered. He said, "Mark Reed, over in Asheville. He's done estate work for half the older families in this county. He'll know what to do. I'll call him tomorrow morning and tell him you're coming." I said, "Thank you, Henry." He said, "Don't thank me yet. You're going to have a long week." We talked for another hour, going through the details. Henry made notes on the back of an envelope. I drank a second cup of his coffee. By the time I drove home, it was past noon, and the sun was high, and the air had warmed up to the kind of warm that only happens in late September in the mountains, that brief warmth that knows it is borrowed. I drove up the hill and parked at the carport. I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. I thought about Margaret. I thought about her in the bed by the window in our room upstairs, in the last week, with the morphine drip and the soft afternoon light. I thought about what she had said to me, her hand in mine, her voice already smaller than it used to be. I had made her a promise. I had not kept it yet, not in the way she had meant. I had been holding the house, but I had not been holding it the way she had asked. I was going to hold it the way she had asked, starting now. I got out of the truck. I walked up onto the porch. I stood at the railing for a moment and looked out across the valley, where the leaves were just starting to turn in the maples by the creek. I said, out loud, to nobody and to her, "I'm going to do it." The wind moved through the oaks, the way it does. I went inside, and I got to work. The week between the two Saturdays was the longest week I had lived in years. I started Monday morning at the workshop. I opened the file cabinet, a green metal thing I'd bought used at an auction back in 1987, and I pulled out the drawer marked Cedar Hill. I had been organized about that drawer once. I had labeled folders. I had kept things in order. Then Margaret had gotten sick, and I had stopped opening the drawer for several years. And when I'd finally opened it again after she passed, the papers had been out of order and dusty, and I had not had the heart to fix them. I fixed them that Monday. I spread everything out on the workbench, the blueprints, rolled in a cardboard tube, the engineering calculations McNally had done for the foundation, on the heavy yellow paper he used, the soil report from the grading, in a manila envelope with the consulting firm's name stamped on it, the materials receipts, in a banker's box I'd had to climb up to the attic to retrieve, permit copies, inspection sign-offs, a letter from the original surveyor with his hand-drawn topographical notes. Pictures, I had a stack of pictures I had taken myself with a 35mm camera of every stage of the build, the footings being poured, the bottom plate being set, the framing going up wall by wall, the roof being raised. I had not looked at those pictures in 20 years. Some of them stopped me cold. There was one of Margaret, standing in what would become the kitchen, in cut-off jeans and one of my old work shirts, holding a level up to a wall stud and grinning at the camera. She was 28 years old in that picture. She had her hair in a long braid down her back, the way she wore it in those days. I sat on my stool at the workbench and looked at that picture for a long time before I set it carefully aside. By Tuesday afternoon, I had everything organized into a single accordion folder, 12 sections, labeled in pencil on the top edge. I had pulled out the items Henry had asked for, and I had added a few more that I thought belonged. There was a section for the chimney. I had kept the receipt from the day I had loaded the stones onto a flatbed trailer at the creek. There was a section for the windows, with the manufacturer's spec sheet showing the weight of the sash cords and the pressure rating of the glass. There was a section just for hurricane straps, the receipts, the diagram showing how I had tied the rafters down to the top plate, to the bottom plate, to the foundation, in a continuous load path that nothing short of a tornado could break. Tuesday evening, I drove into Asheville. I met Mark Reed at his office above a bookstore on Wall Street, the brick part of downtown that has been there since before I was born. Reed was about my age, a soft-spoken man in a gray cardigan, with reading glasses that he kept on a chain around his neck. Henry had called him Monday morning, the way he'd said he would. Reed already had a fair idea of what I wanted. I told him the rest. I told him about Margaret. I told him about the promise. I told him about the children and the loan situation and the access road that ran through the kitchen. Reed listened. He took notes on a yellow pad with a fountain pen. When I was done, he set down the pen and folded his hands on the desk. He said, "Mr. Whitaker, what you're describing is a fairly common instrument. It's called a qualified personal residence trust, with restrictions. We can structure it so that the property passes into a family trust upon your death. The trust can be written to forbid sale, subdivision, or development of the parcel in perpetuity. We can name the beneficiaries your children and any future grandchildren, and we can include a provision that allows any family member to live in the house, with reasonable maintenance obligations." He paused. He said, "We can also, if you wish, include a provision that places the property into the trust immediately upon execution. That would mean you no longer technically own the house. The trust would own it, and you would have lifetime occupancy. The children would have no legal standing to force a sale, now or after your death." I said, "How long would it take to set up?" He said, "Properly drafted, with the survey amendments and the title work, 6 to 8 weeks. I said, "I have 6 days." Reed looked at me over the top of his glasses. He said, "Mr. Whitaker, the trust itself can be drafted and executed in 6 days. The full administrative process takes longer, but the legal protection takes effect the moment you sign. If we get the documents in front of you by Friday, you'll be protected before the weekend." I said, "Then let's do it that way." He nodded once. He said, "I'll have a draft to you by Wednesday evening. We can meet again Thursday afternoon, here in this office, to review and sign." I shook his hand. I drove home in the dark. The trip took longer than usual because there was a wreck on the interstate near Black Mountain, and I sat in stopped traffic for 20 minutes with the radio playing low and the heater humming. I did not mind the wait. It gave me time to think. I thought about how I had been planning to do this for years. I had asked Reed's predecessor about a trust like this back in 2019, the year after Margaret died, and I had let the matter drop because I had not been able to face the paperwork. I had told myself I would get to it. I had told myself there was time. There is always less time than a man thinks. Wednesday, I worked with Henry on the structural folder. He came up to the house in the morning and spent 4 hours walking through it with a clipboard and a flashlight. He went down into the crawl space. He went up into the attic. He measured beam spacing. He photographed the hurricane strap connections. He pulled back a section of insulation in the basement to expose the foundation drainage tile, and he photographed that too. By mid-afternoon, He had filled 4 pages with notes. He sat at my kitchen table that evening and typed up his assessment on a laptop he had brought with him. He read it aloud as he wrote, the way he used to read aloud his inspection reports when we worked together. He used the language of his profession: structural integrity, load path continuity, drainage redundancy, hurricane mitigation factor, and he was generous with that language in a way that he would not have been if it had not been deserved. When he was done, he signed the document with his full name and his retired inspector number, which I had not known he still used. He said, "Arthur, I have inspected exactly 2 houses in this state that I would rate this highly. One of them is the courthouse in Madison County. The other is the one we are sitting in." I said, "Henry, thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. I'm telling the truth. The fact that the truth helps you is just a happy accident." I made him supper. We ate biscuits and ham and a pot of beans I had cooked the day before. We did not talk much. We didn't need to. After he left, around 9, I sat on the porch in the dark for a long time, with my hand on the railing and my eyes on the valley below. The wind had been picking up all evening. The leaves in the oaks rattled in a way they hadn't earlier in the week. Down at the bottom of the hill, the creek sounded louder than usual, which it always did when the air pressure dropped. A storm was coming. I had known it from the weather report. I had known it from the way the dogs at the neighboring farm had been quieter than usual. I had known it from my own knees. I did not yet know how big a storm it would be, but I knew it was coming. And I knew, in the way a builder knows, that my house was ready for it. Thursday afternoon, I drove to Asheville and signed the papers. Reed had a notary in the office across the hall. We finished in under an hour. When I walked out of that office and down the wooden stairs to Wall Street, the house was no longer mine. It belonged to the Whitaker Family Trust. I was the trustee. I had lifetime occupancy. After me, the house would go to my children, and through them to my grandchildren, and through them onward, and it could not be sold, mortgaged, subdivided, or developed by any of them, ever. I stood on the sidewalk outside the bookstore for a long moment, looking up the street toward the courthouse. I felt, oddly, both lighter and heavier than I had felt walking in. Lighter because I had kept my promise. Heavier because I had not known, until I had signed the last page, how much weight I had been carrying. "Margaret, I had kept your promise." I drove home. I made myself supper. I did not sleep well, but I slept enough. Friday I spent on the structural folder. I drove to the county records office in the morning and pulled the public files on Whispering Ridge, the original permit application, the variances granted, the inspection reports, the soils analysis. I made copies of everything. I drove back up the hill and sat at the workbench in the shop and laid the Whispering Ridge documents alongside the Cedar Hill documents and made a side-by-side comparison sheet. I typed it on the old word processor I still kept on a card table in the corner of the workshop. I did not need the comparison to be fancy. I needed it to be accurate. It was accurate. It was painfully accurate. By Friday evening, I had 2 folders ready. The first was the structural folder, which I would put in front of my children on Saturday. The second was a sealed envelope containing the trust documents, which I would not open unless I had to. I hoped I would not have to. I called Daniel on Friday night. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Daniel, I just wanted to confirm for tomorrow." He said, "Yeah, Dad, we're all set. We'll be up around 11. Rebecca's coming separately this time. Tom couldn't get away, so it'll just be her and the kids. Catherine and I are bringing lunch. We figured we'd eat first and then sit down after." I said, "That sounds fine." He said, "Dad, I just want to say I really appreciate you giving this serious thought. I know it hasn't been easy. We're going to take care of you. I promise." I said, "I know you mean that, Daniel." He said, "See you tomorrow, Dad." I hung up the phone. I stood in the kitchen for a while with my hand still on the receiver. Then I went into the hallway and stood in front of the alcove with the trowel and the wedding photograph. I said out loud to my father and to my grandfather and to Margaret, "I'm going to need you tomorrow." The trowel did not answer. It never has. But the steel caught the light the way it always did. And that was enough. That night, I dreamed about my grandfather again. I dreamed about the house he had lived in, the one on the flatland south of Tryon, the one that had been built fast and cheap in the year after the war. I dreamed about being 9 years old, standing in the wet grass in the yard, in a thunderstorm I should not have been outside in. I dreamed about my grandmother screaming, and about my father running toward the house with a coat over his head, and about the sound that a roof makes when wind takes hold of it, the wrong way, a sound that is not quite a tearing and not quite a groaning, but something in between, and something a child should not have to hear. I woke up at 4:30 in the morning with my heart pounding. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. I had not dreamed that dream in 15 years. Outside, the wind was up. The first rain was starting. The storm Earl had warned about, the one Henry had been watching on the weather radio, was beginning to climb the mountains. I went downstairs. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for the sun to come up. Daniel and Catherine arrived at 11, like he'd said. Rebecca and the children came up the drive about 15 minutes behind them. The sky was already gray. The forecast had been talking about the storm all week, a tropical system that had come up the Gulf and was now curling east. Expected to hit the Western Carolinas hard sometime late Saturday night or early Sunday morning. The flood watches were already out. Most of the warnings had not yet been issued. We ate lunch at the dining room table. Catherine had brought sandwiches from a place in Charlotte. Rebecca had brought cookies for the children. Hannah and Caleb were quieter than they had been the week before. I think they had picked up on something they had heard their parents talking in the car. Maybe. Or they had felt the weight of the adults around them. Children know more than we credit them with knowing. After lunch, I told the children they could watch a movie in the parlor. Caleb wanted to be outside, but the rain was starting in earnest, and Rebecca told him no. He sulked for about 30 seconds and then settled in next to his sister on the sofa. And Catherine put on a movie about a dog, and the children were occupied. We adults moved into the kitchen. I had cleared the table. I had set out 4 chairs around it. Daniel had brought a folder of his own, fatter this time, and Catherine had brought a leather notebook. Rebecca had her purse in her lap. Daniel sat down and opened his folder. He said, "Dad, I'm not going to repeat what we talked about last weekend. I think we all know where we stand. We've got the sales contract here, drawn up by the firm in Charlotte. We've got the buyer's intent letter. We've got, and this is the part I'm proudest of, Dad, we've got a contract on the unit at Mountain Brook. They're holding it for you. All you have to do is sign. He slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward me. I did not look at the papers. I said, Daniel, Rebecca, I'd like to show you something before we do anything else. I stood up. I walked into the hallway. I came back with the structural folder. I set it on the table between us, opposite the stack of contracts. I sat down. I took a breath. I said, this is the house I built. I want to walk you through it before you ask me to sign anything that takes it away. I opened the folder slowly, section by section. I started with the soil report. I explained, in plain language, that this hill is made of decomposed granite over a layer of dense clay, and that water on this kind of ground does one of two things: it runs off cleanly, or it pools and undermines whatever is sitting on it. I showed them the drainage diagram I had designed and McNally had stamped. I showed them the 4 perforated pipes that ran around the perimeter of the foundation, 4 feet down, all of them connected to a daylighting outlet at the far side of the property. I showed them the receipts for the gravel, 22 tons of clean number 57 stone, packed around those pipes by hand. Daniel said, Dad, why are we doing this? I said, because you're asking me to tear it down. The least you can do is know what you're tearing down. He sat back. He did not interrupt me again for a long time. I showed them the foundation. I showed them McNally's calculations, the depth of the footings, the rebar grid, the cement to aggregate ratio. I showed them the photographs I had taken the day of the pour. I showed them the inspection sign-off and a second voluntary inspection I had requested from a structural engineer 6 months after the pour to verify cure quality. I showed them my notes on the day of that second inspection, with the engineer's signature at the bottom of the page. I showed them the framing. I showed them the doubled bottom plates, the studs on 12-inch centers instead of the code-required 16, the structural sheathing half-inch oriented strand board, glued and nailed instead of just nailed, a detail that doubles the sheer strength of the wall. I showed them the hurricane straps. I showed them the continuous load path diagram. I explained what a continuous load path means, that in a high wind, the force on the roof has to travel down through the rafters, through the top plate, through the studs, through the bottom plate, through the foundation, and into the ground, without breaking that chain anywhere along the line. I showed them where I had reinforced every link in that chain. I showed them the roof. I showed them the metal panels, 24 gauge, screwed every 6 inches into the purlins, with a fastener pattern designed for wind speeds up to 140 miles per hour. I showed them the underlayment, 2 layers of ice and water shield instead of the 1 layer required by code. I showed them the ridge venting, the eave venting, the gable bracing. I showed them the chimney. I told them about the stones, that I had pulled every one of them out of the creek bed at the bottom of the hill, that I had set every one of them myself. In mortar, Margaret had mixed for me. In the summer, when we were both 33 years old, and our oldest child was 3 years old, and our youngest was on the way. I showed them the photograph of Margaret with the mortar bucket, laughing, with mortar on her cheek. Rebecca made a small sound, half a breath, half something else, and she put her hand to her mouth. I kept going. I showed them the windows. I showed them the receipts. I told them what each window had cost in 1983, and what it would cost to replace today. And I told them why I had spent the extra money, because cheap windows fail. And they fail at the worst moment. And the worst moment is the moment your family needs the house most. I showed them the comparison sheet, the side-by-side, Cedar Hill on the left, Whispering Ridge on the right, footing depth 4 feet versus 3 feet, minimum, rebar half-inch grid at 12 inches on center versus 3/8 bars at 24 inches, where present at all. Foundation drainage perforated pipe with gravel and filter fabric versus none documented. Framing connection to foundation full hurricane strap continuous load path versus standard anchor bolts at 4-foot spacing. Roof 24-gauge metal screwed at 6 inches versus 20-year asphalt shingles nailed at standard. Sheathing glued and nailed structural OSB versus stapled fiberboard with vinyl wrap. Line by line, the whole sheet. Cedar Hill against the houses Daniel was building. Against the houses he wanted to sell my land to build more of. Against the houses my daughter lived in. I had not put Magnolia Park on the sheet. I had not had time to pull those records. But everyone at the table knew what was missing from the sheet, and what was implied. I showed them Henry Caldwell's structural assessment. I read aloud his last paragraph, the one about the courthouse in Madison County and the house we were sitting in. I showed them his signature and his retired inspector number. Then I closed the folder. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter. I said, "This is what you're asking me to tear down. I want you to understand it. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to understand it." Daniel sat very still. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. He was looking at the closed folder, not at me. Catherine was looking at Daniel. Rebecca was looking at her hands. Daniel said, finally, "Dad, that's all very impressive. But it doesn't change the math." I said, "What math?" He said, "The math of the property. The market doesn't care how well you built it. The market cares about location and acreage and zoning. The structure on the lot is essentially worthless from a development standpoint. We'd be demolishing it regardless. So the question is not whether your house is well built. The question is, what's the highest and best use of this land?" I said, "Daniel, there's something else you need to know." He said, "What?" I said, "I heard your call last Sunday morning. The one in the yard, with Marcus." Daniel's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went still in a way that was almost not a face anymore, just a held breath. Catherine looked at him sharply. Rebecca looked up. I said, "I heard you talk about your loan situation. I heard you say you needed this closed by the middle of October. I heard you say that the house comes down because the access road runs through the kitchen. I heard you say that I just needed to feel like it was my idea." The kitchen was very quiet. The only sound was the rain on the metal roof, which had picked up considerably while we had been sitting there. It was a steady drumming sound now, deeper than it had been an hour ago. Daniel said, "Dad." I said, "I'm not done." He stopped. I said, "I am not selling this house. I was not going to sell it under any conditions. But I want you to know, both of you, that the reason I'm not selling it is not the one you think." I reached into the inside pocket of my flannel shirt, and I took out a small folded envelope. I had been carrying it in that pocket since Thursday evening. I said, This is a copy of a trust document I signed on Thursday afternoon at a lawyer's office in Asheville. The house and the land, all 9 acres, have been placed into a family trust. I am the trustee. I have lifetime occupancy. The beneficiaries are the 2 of you, and your children, and any future grandchildren. The terms of the trust make it impossible for any beneficiary to sell, subdivide, mortgage, or develop this property. Ever. Not while I'm alive, and not after I'm dead. Daniel's face went from still to white. I said, I want to be clear about why I did this. I did not do it to spite you. Daniel, I did not do it to punish either of you. I did it because your mother asked me to. I could feel my voice getting tight then. I did not let it stop me. I said, in the last week of her life, your mother told me that the 2 of you were going to be tested in ways neither of you could see coming. She told me that one day the world was going to knock both of you off your feet. She told me, and these are very close to her exact words, that when that day came, you were going to need a place that could not be sold out from under you, a place that would still be standing no matter what fell down around it. She asked me to keep this house, no matter what either of you asked me to do with it. She asked me to keep it until it was the place you needed it to be. I promised her I would. I looked at Rebecca. She was crying quietly. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still. And the tears were just running down her face without her doing anything about them. I said, last weekend, Rebecca, you said I was selfish. You said I was holding on to this house because I couldn't let go of your mother. I'm telling you that the opposite is true. I'm holding on to this house because your mother asked me to. Because she knew things about you and your brother that I am only now starting to understand. Because she saw, before I did, that there was going to come a day when this house was going to be the most useful thing I had left in the world. I closed the folder. I slid the trust envelope back into my pocket. I said, I'm not signing your papers. Daniel, I am sorry about your loan situation. I would have been glad to help you with it if you had asked me. You did not ask me. You tried to take from me instead. I want you to think about the difference between those 2 things. Daniel did not say anything for a long time. He was staring at the folder. His jaw was working, but no sound was coming out. Catherine said, very quietly, we should go. Daniel nodded. He stood up. He gathered his folder with shaking hands. Rebecca said, Dad! I said, I love you, sweetheart. Drive carefully going home. The roads will be wet. They left. Daniel did not say goodbye. Catherine touched my shoulder lightly on the way out. Rebecca came back into the kitchen after gathering the children and hugged me without saying anything, and I hugged her back. And her hair smelled the way it had when she was a little girl. Then they were gone. Both cars went down the hill through the rain, and I stood at the front window and watched the taillights disappear into the gray. I was alone in the house again. The rain on the roof was loud now. The wind in the oaks had a new edge to it, the kind that meant a long night was coming. I went into the kitchen. I turned on the radio. The voice on the weather station was already calling the storm by its name, and the name had become a warning. The storm came up the mountains in the dark. By 6 o'clock that evening, the rain was coming sideways. By 7, the wind was strong enough that the porch swing was knocking against the house, and I went out in my slicker and took it down and laid it on the porch floor where it would not become a battering ram. By 8, the lights flickered for the first time, and I went around the house and lit the kerosene lamps I keep in the closet by the back door, the same way my mother used to do in the storms of my childhood. 3 lamps, one in the kitchen, one in the parlor, one in the hallway by the alcove with the trowel. By 9, the power was out for good. I sat in the kitchen at the table with one lamp burning low, and a battery radio tuned to the weather station, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I wasn't paying attention. The radio voice was professional and steady, but I could hear the strain underneath it. Flash flood warnings for every county in the western part of the state. Wind gusts measured at 78 miles per hour at the airport. Trees down across 3 of the 4 major routes out of the mountains. The interstate closed between Asheville and Hendersonville on account of a tractor trailer that had been blown onto its side in the median. The voice asked listeners to stay inside, to stay away from windows, to check on their elderly neighbors if they could do so safely. I am the elderly neighbor. I sat at the table and listened. The house was making sounds I had not heard it make before, and yet they were sounds I recognized the way an old man recognizes the cough of a friend, even after many years apart. The metal roof was singing in the wind, a low, almost musical hum, the way it does when the wind hits it at just the right angle. The windows in the dining room rattled occasionally, but only the storm windows. The inner sash held steady. The chimney made a soft, pluffing sound now and then, the way chimneys do when downdrafts come and go. But the house did not move. The walls did not flex. The floor under my feet was as solid as it had been on a clear day in July. I had built this house to do exactly this. I had built it expecting a night like this, and the house was doing what I had asked it to do. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a crash somewhere outside. A sharp, loud crack followed by a deeper thud. A tree had come down. Not on the house, I would have felt that, but somewhere out in the lower pasture, maybe near where the access road meets the county road. I made a note to look in the morning. Then I went back to my coffee, which I had refilled by then with hot water from a thermos. I thought about my children. They had left the hill by 2 in the afternoon. They would have been home by 6, both of them, with the rain coming down hard, but the worst of the storm still hours behind them. Rebecca would be in Magnolia Park. Daniel and Catherine would be in their condominium in downtown Charlotte. They would be safe. The storm was supposed to hit Charlotte too, but Charlotte was farther from the system's track than the mountains were, and the worst of the wind would stay west of them. I hoped they would be safe. I hoped both of my children would sit out the storm in warm, dry rooms and would wake up tomorrow to wet streets but undamaged homes. I had no way of knowing, sitting there in my kitchen, that I was wrong about that. The wind picked up again around 11. The radio reported wind gusts of 91 miles per hour at the top of Mount Pisgah. The voice said the storm had stalled, that the eye, what little there was left of an eye at this latitude, had parked itself over the Blue Ridge and was dumping rain at a rate the meteorologists were calling historic. 8 inches in 6 hours over much of the region. Some places reporting 10. Some places they had not yet heard from. I went around the house with the lamp. I checked every window. I checked the back door and the front door. I checked the basement stairs and looked down into the basement to see if any water had come in through the foundation. None had. The drainage system was carrying everything away, the way I had built it to do. I went into the parlor and sat in my chair by the window. The lamp was on the side table. The window glass was streaming with rain, but the rain was running off the slope of the roof 8 feet above me and falling onto the porch, and from the porch onto the ground, and from the ground into the drainage that ran around the house and out to the daylighting point on the south side. I could not see the drainage in the dark. I could not see anything outside but blackness with streaks of water on it. But I knew, the way you know things about a thing you have made with your hands, that the drainage was working. I sat in the chair for a long time. I did not read. I did not turn on the radio again. I just sat, with the lamp burning low, and the wind howling around the eaves, and the house steady under me. And I thought about my father. I thought about the day he gave me the trowel. I was 9 years old. It was September of 1969. We were standing in the front yard of my grandfather's house, or what was left of it. 2 days after a storm had come through and taken half the roof off and dropped a sycamore tree through the kitchen and into the back bedroom where my grandfather had been sleeping. My grandfather had not gotten out. My grandmother had been in the front bedroom and had gotten out. By way of a window, my father had broken with his fist to reach her. My grandmother lived with us for the next 23 years until she died. My father stood in the yard of that house with me on the 3rd day, when we had come back to gather what could be gathered from the wreckage. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were always either dirty or just washed. He was a builder. His father had been a builder before him. He was 41 years old that September. He had just lost his father in a storm. He held the trowel in his hand. He had pulled it out of the rubble of the front room. The blade was scratched, but not bent. The wooden handle was a little muddy. He stood there holding it and looking at the wreckage of the house his father had built. And then he turned, and he looked at me. He said, "Arthur, come here." I came over. He said, "Hold out your hand." I held out my hand. He put the trowel in it. He said, "Your grandfather built this house in 1946. He had just come back from the war. He didn't have any money. He used what he could find. He built it fast because he had a family to put under a roof. He didn't build it wrong. Arthur. He built it the only way he could at the time. But he didn't build it for a night like Tuesday night." He paused. I remember the pause because it lasted a long time. He was looking at the trowel in my hand. He was looking at me. He said, "Arthur, when you build your house and you will, someday, you'll build a house, you build it for the worst night. Not the best night. Not the average night. The worst night. The night nobody thinks is coming. You build it for that night. And then if that night never comes, you've lost nothing. And if it comes, you've saved everything." He closed my fingers around the handle of the trowel. He said, "This trowel belonged to my father. He used it to build this house. It is the only thing of his that is still here. I am giving it to you. Arthur, I want you to use it to build the house you build. I want it to be a better house than this one was. Do you understand me, son?" I said, "Yes, sir." I did understand him. Even at 9, I understood him. A child knows when his father is telling him something that is going to matter for the rest of his life. A child does not always know what to do with that knowledge, but he knows when it lands. I had used that trowel on every foundation I had ever poured, every chimney, every stone wall, every set of front steps. I had used it on Cedar Hill. I had used it on the foundation I was now sitting above. On the night, the worst night my father had warned me about had finally come. I sat in the parlor with the lamp burning low, and the trowel was on its nail in the alcove down the hall. And outside, the wind howled around a house that was doing exactly what I had built it to do. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, instead, something quieter and stranger. I felt like my father was in the room with me, like my grandfather was in the room with me, like Margaret was in the room with me, like every person who had ever loved me and gone on was standing in that parlor in the dark, and we were all of us listening to the wind together. I sat that way for a long time. Eventually, around 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind began to ease. The rain kept coming, but the screaming sound at the eaves softened to a moan, and then to a hiss. I got up from the chair. My knees complained. I went into the kitchen. I poured the last of the coffee from the thermos and drank it standing at the window over the sink, looking out into the dark. There was no light anywhere in the valley. The whole valley was black. I went upstairs. I lay down on top of the bedspread in my clothes. I slept. Finally, the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who has been awake too long. When I woke, it was just after dawn, and the world outside my window was a wreck. The sun came up clean and pale over the eastern ridge. I had not expected that. After a night like that, you expect the next day to look like the night did, but the sky was blue and almost cloudless, the way it sometimes is after a tropical system blows through. The air was cold. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees while I was sleeping. I stood on the back porch in my coat, with my hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee, brewed on the camp stove I keep in the shop for power outages, and I looked out at what the storm had done. In my own yard, not much. A few branches down, a patch of shingles missing from the workshop roof. The clothesline post had been pulled out of the ground at one corner. The big oak in the front had lost a major limb, which had fallen across the gravel drive, but not on the house. That was all. The house itself was untouched. The drainage had carried the water away. The roof had held. The porch was wet but intact. The chimney was straight. But out beyond my fence line, out across the valley, down toward the county road, and especially down toward Briar Gap, I could see what the storm had done to other places. I could see whole trees down everywhere. The county road had a tree across it about half a mile from the bottom of my drive. Power lines were sagging or broken, down by the creek. The water was high and brown and had spread out across the lower pasture for 30 yards on either side of the normal channel, out past the lumber mill, where Whispering Ridge sat on the cleared ridge above the old dairy farm. I could not see the development from my porch, but I could see the column of smoke rising from somewhere out that way. Somebody had a fire, a downed line, maybe a propane tank. I got the battery radio going. The voice on the news was different now, not professional and steady, tired, strained. The voice was reading numbers, the number of homes without power, the number of roads closed, the number of confirmed deaths, which was already in the double digits and would rise through the day. The voice was reading the names of communities that had been hit hardest. Some of those communities were on my side of the mountain. The voice was reading the locations of emergency shelters. Then the voice said something that made me stand up straight at my own kitchen counter. The voice said that in the early hours of the morning, a flash flood had come through the new subdivision of Magnolia Park, on the western side of Raleigh. The voice said that the storm system had moved east faster than predicted and had stalled over the central part of the state, dumping 11 inches of rain in 5 hours, and that the retention pond on the upper edge of Magnolia Park had failed around 4:30 in the morning, sending a wall of water down through the development. The voice said that no fatalities had yet been reported, but that dozens of homes were a total loss, that the cosmetic damage to many more was severe, and that residents had been evacuated to a high school gymnasium 5 miles away. I set my coffee down. The voice went on. The voice said that early reports were coming in of severe damage to a number of mountain developments as well. The voice mentioned Whispering Ridge by name. The voice said that several homes there had lost their roofs, that one home had collapsed entirely on its foundation, that the access road into the development had washed out. I went to the phone. I picked it up. There was no dial tone. The line was down. I went out to the truck. The truck started on the 3rd try. I backed it up to the edge of the drive and saw the limb across the gravel and got the chainsaw out of the bed and spent 30 minutes cutting it up and clearing it. By the time I had a path open, my hands were shaking with cold and with something else. I drove down the hill slowly. The county road had been partially cleared by someone, a neighbor with a truck and a saw. Probably the way these things get done in country places before the official crews arrive. I followed the cleared lane down toward Briar Gap. In town, the diner was open. The post office was closed. The hardware store was open, and Earl was standing on the sidewalk in front of it talking to 2 men with chainsaws. I rolled my window down as I went past. Earl saw me. He raised one hand. I raised mine. I parked in front of the diner. Patty was inside with a coffee pot, pouring for a half-dozen men in work clothes. The power was on at the diner. They have a generator. I sat at the counter. Patty poured me a cup. She said, "You all right up there?" "Arthur," I said, "we're fine. The house is fine." She said, "I had a feeling." I said, "Have you heard anything from out east?" Raleigh sighed. She said, It's bad over there. Worse than here. Maybe. They had a dam break or something. A whole subdivision underwater." I said, "Magnolia Park." She said, "That sounds right." I sat at the counter. I drank my coffee. After about 20 minutes, the door opened, and Henry Caldwell came in. He saw me. He came over. He sat down beside me. Patty poured him a cup. Henry said, "You heard." I said, "I heard about Raleigh and about Whispering Ridge." Henry said, "Whispering Ridge is gone. Arthur, I drove out there an hour ago. There's nothing left of 7 of those houses. The roofs peeled off. The framing went. The walls came down on top of whatever was inside. 2 more are leaning. The rest are damaged. They evacuated everybody just before the worst of it. Thank God. Nobody killed. But Arthur, those houses had been occupied. Families had bought them. They're standing in the high school gym in Briar Gap right now with nothing but the clothes they had on." I closed my eyes for a moment. I said, "And Raleigh?" Henry said, "Raleigh is worse." The retention pond at Magnolia Park gave way. Most of the houses on the lower half of that development took on 4 to 6 feet of water in 15 minutes. The structures didn't fail like Whispering Ridge they're standing, but the interiors are gutted. Drywall is mush. Floors are buckled. Mold's already starting. I sat with that. I said, "Henry, drive me to a phone that works. Mine is out." He said, "There's a landline at the church. The deacon's there. I'll take you." We left our coffee. We drove the 3 blocks to the Methodist church in Henry's truck. The deacon let us in. He gave me the phone. I called Rebecca first. The call went through. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was thin. She said, "Dad." I said, "Sweetheart." She said, "Daddy, we lost the house. We lost everything." I said, "Where are you? Where are the children?" She said, "We're at the high school. They put us in the gym. The kids are okay. Tom is okay. We're okay. But the house, Daddy, there's nothing left. Nothing." I said, "Rebecca, listen to me. Are the children with you right now? Are they near you?" She said, "They're with me. They're playing on a cot. They think it's an adventure." I said, "Sweetheart, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I want you to put your things in your car. You and Tom and the children. You drive west. You come up the mountain. You drive carefully, because the roads are bad. But you come straight here. Do you understand me? You come home." She said, "Daddy, after what we after last weekend." I said, "Rebecca, get in the car. Come home." She was crying. She said, "Yes, sir. We will. We'll leave in an hour." I said, "Where's your brother?" She said, "He called me at 6 this morning. The lobby of his condominium building flooded. They're fine, but his car is in the underground garage and the garage is full of water. His company has a project on the south side of Charlotte that took a direct hit. He's Daddy. He's not in a good place. I don't know if he can drive." I said, "Tell him to call me. I'm at the church. He has the number." She said, "Yes, Daddy." She hung up. I stood in the deacon's office with the phone in my hand. Henry was watching me from the doorway. I said, "They're coming. Rebecca and the children. And Daniel. I hope." Henry said, "Of course they are." I gave the phone back to the deacon. I thanked him. Henry drove me back to my truck. I drove up the hill to Cedar Hill. Slowly. Around the limbs and the puddles and the wet leaves plastered to the asphalt like wet paper. I went into the house. I took off my coat. I built up the wood stove. I started a pot of beans. I made up the beds in the upstairs rooms, both guest rooms, and the small room down the hall that had been Rebecca's when she was a girl. I put fresh sheets on Caleb and Hannah's beds. I put extra blankets at the foot of each one. I took the dust cover off the rocking chair in the parlor. I lit the lamp in the hallway, even though the power was back on by then, because I wanted them to see a light when they came up the drive. Then I sat on the porch in my coat and waited. The first car came up the hill a little after 3 in the afternoon. It was Rebecca's van. Tom was driving. Rebecca was in the passenger seat. The children were in the back. They were all of them wet, in clothes they had been wearing for a day. Hannah's hair was tangled. Caleb was asleep with his face against the window. Rebecca got out of the van first. She walked up the steps to the porch and stood in front of me without speaking. Her face was red and swollen from crying. She did not look like the woman who had sat in her mother's chair 8 days before. I stood up. I opened my arms. She came into them. The second car came up the hill an hour later. It was Daniel's. He was alone. Catherine had stayed in Charlotte to deal with their building. He had driven the mountain road in conditions he had no business driving in. His hands were still shaking when he got out of the car. He walked up the steps. He did not say anything. He stopped at the top step and he looked at me. And his face was the face of a man who had not slept and had not yet found the words for what had happened to him. I said, "Come inside, son. There's coffee on." He came inside. The first night was the quietest night the house had known in years. I had thought, when I made up the beds that afternoon, that I was preparing for a kind of homecoming. I was wrong about the word. A homecoming has a brightness to it. What came up my hill that day was something else. Something quieter. Heavier. More like the moment when a wounded animal finally stops running and lays down. My children did not come home that day. They came to ground. Rebecca cried off and on for the first 3 hours. Not loud crying. The slow kind. The kind that doesn't ask for anything. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I had made her. And every few minutes the tears would come again, and she would wipe them with the heel of her hand and take a sip and stop. Tom sat beside her with one hand on her back. He had not said much since they had come up the steps. He is not a man who knows what to do with grief that is not his own. The children, on the other hand, had recovered the way children do. Caleb had asked if he could sleep in the room with the window seat, and Hannah had asked if she could help me feed the wood stove, and I had shown her how, and she had taken on the job with the seriousness of a temple keeper. Daniel did not speak for almost an hour after he came inside. He sat in the wing chair by the parlor window, my chair, and looked out at the gray afternoon. His hands folded in his lap. His shoulders had a slope to them I had never seen on my son before. Daniel had always carried his shoulders high. The man in my parlor that afternoon was carrying his shoulders the way an old man carries them. I let him sit. There are griefs that have to be sat with before they can be spoken about, and the worst thing a person can do is fill the silence too soon. I went in and out of the parlor with wood for the stove, and I made beans and cornbread for supper. And I put on a pot of decaf because I knew nobody was going to sleep well that night anyway. At supper, Caleb told me about how he had seen a fish swim through the living room window of a neighbor's house. He told it the way he told all his stories, bigger each time, with his hands moving, and Rebecca laughed at one of his exaggerations. It was the first time I had heard my daughter laugh in over a week. The sound surprised her too. She put her hand over her mouth as if she had done something improper. I said, "Sweetheart, it's all right to laugh. The children are okay. Laughing is allowed." She looked at me with her eyes filling up again. And she nodded. After supper, I helped Rebecca get the children upstairs. Hannah stayed up a little longer, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking around the small room with the wallpaper that had been there since her mother had been a girl. She said, "Grandpa, was this Mom's room?" I said, "Yes, baby." This was her room. She said, "It's nice that we get to be here." I had to look out the window for a moment before I could answer her. I said, "It is. Hannah, it's nice that you get to be here." Downstairs, I went out onto the back porch. Daniel was still there. He had been there for over an hour. He was leaning on the railing with both hands, looking out at the valley, where a few lights were coming back on in the distance as the power company worked through the night. I came up beside him. I did not say anything for a long time. We just stood there together, with the stars coming out, and the wind soft in the oaks. Daniel said, "Finally, Dad, I don't know what to say to you." I said, "Then don't say anything yet." He said, "I was going to take your house, to save my own." I said, "I know." He turned and looked at me. His face in the porch light was older than I had ever seen it. He said, "Why aren't you angry?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Daniel, I was angry. Most of last week, I was angry. But anger is not what holds a foundation. Anger is what cracks one. Tonight you're here, and your sister is here, and the children are here, and the house is standing. That's the end of the matter as far as anger is concerned." He stood there for a long time. Eventually, his shoulders began to shake. He was crying. He did not make any sound. He just cried. And I stood beside him. And I did not touch him. Because there are moments when a man needs his father to be present without being intrusive. And I have learned, late in my life, the difference between the two. When he was done, he wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, "How did you know to build it like this?" I said, "A long time ago, son, my father told me to build for the worst night. I'll tell you about it sometime. Not tonight. Sometime." He nodded. We went inside. I sat alone in the kitchen for a while after that. The house was quiet around me. 5 people sleeping under my roof, 6, counting me for the first time in 7 years. Cedar Hill had not held that many sleeping bodies since the Christmas before Margaret died. I looked at the empty chair across from me, the chair Margaret used to sit in. I said, out loud, "Margaret, they're home." The clock ticked. The wood stove ticked. The wind moved softly through the oaks. I went up to bed. The days that followed were strange and tender ones. 5 adults and 2 children in a house built for 2, and yet the house did not feel crowded. It felt the way a house is supposed to feel, which is full. We fell into a rhythm without anyone deciding what it was. I made breakfast in the mornings. Rebecca washed dishes, the way she had done as a girl. Tom split firewood at the back of the property, which he had never done in his life, and he did it badly at first, and then better. Catherine drove up from Charlotte on the 3rd day with a carload of supplies, stayed 2 nights, and went back. Daniel did not go back with her. Daniel stayed. The children turned the back pasture into a kingdom. Caleb found the chipmunk he had been looking for, and named it. Hannah took up residence at the kitchen table with a sketchbook, and she drew the windowsill above the sink, the rocking chair, the chimney from outside, the trowel in the alcove. She showed me the drawings shyly, They were better than I would have expected. She had her grandmother's eye. On the fourth night, after the children were asleep, Daniel came into the kitchen and sat down across from me. He told me everything. The project in Charlotte that had gone sideways 2 years before. The second project he had taken on to cover the first. The personal loans. The partners who had pulled out. The way one bad decision had built on another. He told me about Marcus, who was not a partner but a kind of vulture. He told me that the access road through my kitchen had been Marcus's idea, but that he had not said no to it, and that the not saying no had been the worst thing he had ever done. He told me about Catherine. He told me she had not known. He told me he had hidden it from her, the way men hide things from the women who love them when they cannot bear to be seen failing. When he was done, I poured us both a second cup of coffee. I said, "Daniel, if your mother had been alive last month, what do you think she would have said to you?" He was quiet for a long time. He said, "She would have asked me why I didn't just ask you for help." I said, "And what would you have said to her?" He said, "I would have said I couldn't bear for you to know." I nodded. I said, "Daniel, a father is not embarrassed by a son's failure. A father is only embarrassed by a son's pride. Failure is what we expect from all of us. Sooner or later, pride is what gets in the way of being helped." He sat with that. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said, "Once is enough." "Daniel, you said it. I heard you. We can move on." The next afternoon, Rebecca and I sat on the back porch. The children were down at the creek. She said, "Daddy, last weekend, in the parlor, I called you selfish." I said, "You did." She said, "I was the selfish one. I was repeating things I had been telling myself for years, because telling myself those things made it easier not to come up here. It made it easier to forget how much I missed Mom by pretending you were the one who couldn't let go. I'm so sorry, Daddy." I reached over and put my hand over hers. I said, "Sweetheart, forgetting is what people do. Remembering is what we have to teach each other. I forgot some things about you too. I forgot how to talk to you. I should have shown you the house years ago, the way I showed you a week ago. I'm sorry too." She put her head on my shoulder. We sat there on the porch for a long time without speaking. Somewhere down by the creek, Caleb was hollering at his sister about something, and the world was, very quietly, putting itself back together. That evening, after supper, I asked everyone to come into the parlor. I lit the lamps. Hannah helped me because she liked to. I told them about the trust. I told it gently this time, and slowly. And I told the children too. I told them that this house, Cedar Hill, was now legally a kind of promise, that when they were grown up, and they were tired, or sad, or in trouble, they could come back to it. Not in the way that money is yours in a different way. In the way that a place is yours when you know no one can take it away from you. Hannah said, very seriously, "So we can't ever sell it." I said, "That's right, Hannah." She said, "Even if we wanted to." I said, "Even if you wanted to." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Caleb said, "Can I have the room with the window seat when I'm grown up?" I said, "You can have whichever room you want." buddy." Rebecca was crying quietly. Daniel was looking at the floor. Tom had his hand on Rebecca's back. I said, "There's one more thing I want to do tonight." I went into the hallway. I lifted the trowel down off its nail. I came back into the parlor and stood in front of Caleb. I said, "Caleb, I want to tell you about this trowel." I told him the short version, about his great-great-grandfather, who had owned it first, about the storm that had taken his great-great-grandfather's house, about my own father, who had given the trowel to me when I was about Caleb's age, about every foundation I had laid with it, about the house we were sitting in. I said, "This trowel has been in our family for 3 generations. Caleb, one day, it will be yours. Not tonight. You're a little too small still, but when you're older, old enough to take care of it, it will come to you. And then you will pass it on to someone in your family." Caleb looked at the trowel with very large eyes. He said, "I'll take good care of it, Grandpa." I said, "I know you will." I put the trowel back on its nail. We sat together for a while longer. Tom built up the fire. Rebecca leaned against her brother on the sofa, the way she used to when they were children. The lamps burned soft. It was an ordinary evening. It was the most extraordinary evening I had spent in 7 years. It is December now. The first snow came last week. The hill is white. The metal roof has a soft cap of it. The smoke from the chimney rises straight up in the cold air. Rebecca and Tom went back to Raleigh 2 weeks after the storm to begin the long work of dealing with insurance and contractors. They left the children with me for a week, which I understood to be partly a gift she was giving me and partly a gift she was giving the children. We had a fine week. Hannah finished her sketchbook. Caleb learned to skip a rock 4 times across the pond at the bottom of the pasture, which he considered the major accomplishment of his life thus far. Daniel stayed 3 weeks. He worked beside me on a dozen small projects around the house, not the way a son works beside his father at the start, but the way a son works beside his father when the son has become old enough to understand what the father is doing. We had Thanksgiving at Cedar Hill that year. All of us. Rebecca and Tom and the children, Daniel and Catherine, Henry Caldwell, because he had nowhere else to go and was family by now anyway. We filled all 8 chairs at the dining room table for the first time in many years, and we had to drag in a 9th chair from the parlor for Henry. We said grace. We ate slowly. We laughed. Margaret's chair in the parlor is no longer empty. Hannah has claimed it as her own when she visits. She sits in it and draws in her new sketchbook and rocks gently while she draws. I do not stop her. A chair like that wants a person in it. Daniel calls every Sunday now. We talk for an hour, sometimes 2. We do not talk about business. We talk about the weather and the dog he and Catherine adopted last month, and the small woodworking projects he has begun in his garage on weekends. He has bought a set of chisels. He sends me pictures of the things he is making. They are not good yet. They will be in time. He is learning, the way you learn anything worth learning, slowly, and with respect for the material. I think often, these days, about the night of the storm, about sitting alone in the parlor with the lamp burning low, and the wind howling at the eaves, and the trowel on its nail in the hallway. I think about my father, and the lesson he gave me when I was 9 years old. I think about Margaret, and the promise she pulled out of me in the last week of her life. I think about how a man builds his house, if he is fortunate, only once. But he learns, over time, that the house is not the only thing he is building. He is building the people who will come back to it. He is building the love that will outlast him. He is building the sound of voices around a table he made with his own hands. Those things, too, need foundations. They need to be built for the worst night. I do not know how many years I have left. I am 65. My hands are crooked. My knees are loud. But I have come to believe, in this past season, that the work I have done has been enough. The house stands. The family has come back. The promise has been kept. The next generation has been handed something they can hold. That is more than most men get. That is more than I had any right to ask for. So that is my story, or part of it, anyway. The part I wanted to tell you tonight. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Truly. There is something a little remarkable about a stranger listening to an old man's story all the way to the end, and I do not take it for granted. I hope that somewhere in what I have shared, there was something that landed where you needed it to land: a word, a picture, a memory of your own that came up while you were listening. That is what these stories are for. Not for the teller, for the listener. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would give it a thumbs up, share it with someone you love, or subscribe to keep hearing more stories like this one. Your listening means more than you know. And if you are going through a hard season of your own, if your own house is shaking in a storm tonight, of whatever kind, I want to leave you with this: the foundation you have built, the love you have given, the patience you have shown, the promises you have kept. None of it is wasted. None of it is lost. The Lord, in His own way, does not let good work fall down. He may let the wind blow. He may let the rain come. But the things you have built well, He keeps. May your house stand. May your family find its way home. And may you, like me, be quietly surprised one day by how much of what you built has held. Good night, friend, and God bless you.